Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining. Hi, Will. How's it going?
Good. Hey, Alex, and hey, everyone. Good to see everyone here today.
Good to see you too. It's the first episode of a new series, so we starting something completely fresh today. So episode one of the GraphQL Full Stack GraphQL Book Club. I'm looking forward to this. Should be fun. Thank you everybody for joining. I mean, I quickly wanna share a few words about nodes before we dive in. So next week, it's happening next week. So really soon is nodes 2022 on the 16th and the 17th of October of November. Sorry, and we have a full 24 hours, almost full day of content for all experience levels, from beginners to experienced to very advanced topics, all around the wilder world of graphs and graph technology. So it should be fun. It should be very interesting. I today looked over the agenda and I saw a couple of GraphQL sessions in there as well. So if you're particularly interested in GraphQL topic, you will find something there for sure. So go to the page. The link was in chat. I'll post it again in a second. Here it is. Everybody can go there and check it out. So would be great to see you there to follow along. Will, you also have a talk?
I do, yeah. So there'll be a little bit of GraphQL in my nodes talk, but it's really about how do I work with geospatial data in Neo4j. And so this is something that comes up a lot, is I think more and more folks are interested in working with spatial data in Neo4j. And so we're going to go through different ways of how do I load geospatial data in Neo4j and sort of what are some of the advantages. Can I do things like graph algorithms? Can I do routing? How can I visualize geospatial data with Neo4j? So I'm working on the talk this week, and I'm trying to build as many demos as I possibly can to cram in 45 minutes. And so far I have 5. So I want like 6 or 7 though, because I really want to show lots of different use cases. So we'll see. Right now I'm looking at OpenStreetMap data.
Yeah. Cool. So that's notes next week. So I would really hope to see you there, everybody, and have a good time. But today we have a different topic. We talk about the GraphQL book, and I see you have already something ready here. So the Full Stack GraphQL Applications book has been published in a month or so ago, not too long ago. So a couple of months, maybe 2 months, maybe ago. So it's a ebook and a physical book actually that Will wrote. And if you want, you can download it for free. So you can go to this page, and I post it in Slack, and can make the little overlay here as well. If you go to dev.neo4j.com/GraphQL-book, you are able to download the book, and this is the page on the right hand side that you can see there, and you can download it for free. Also, I mean, if you don't want to register for 2 things, you can register for notes, and if you register for notes, you also get the ebook.
Oh, that's fun.
So
I didn't realize that. That's cool.
Yeah, so you get the ebook if you do. There's a goodie bag section in notes, and you get a couple of cool things. So I don't want to spoil it, but among the cool virtual goodie bag, we have an offer for everybody that registers for notes. You get the Full Stack GraphQL Applications book as well.
Nice, that's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and today, I mean, the idea of the series is the book has 9 chapters, and we want to take these 9 chapters and make them. Every episode will be 1 chapter. So obviously today, starting with chapter 1, and we go through the content. We show you a few examples, what's there, what's in there, and give a couple of coding examples as well, where there were test learning examples sort of in the book, and follow along through here, and everybody else can also follow along if you like. So I guess all you need is you don't even need the book, I guess, at this point, because we will have the book for you ready, but download the book afterwards. But we will guide you through, and all you need is probably, maybe an Aura free instance that would probably be helpful, or a desktop instance, or a sandbox open if you want to code along directly live now. But you can, this will be obviously available for afterwards. So if you don't want to code along yourself directly right now, watch it and to do the exercises afterwards yourself, and whenever you feel like it.
Yeah, I thought what would be fun format to do with this series is really have, like you said, each one of these streams focus on one of the 9 chapters, and we'll review some of the concepts a little bit, show some examples. But what I really want to do is just make the time available for folks who have questions as you're working through the book. Like bring your questions. Happy to answer any of those. And also, if you have questions about what it's like to write a technical book, that happy to talk about that too. That was kind of a new experience
I
for me.
definitely would like to know. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. One spoiler I will say about writing the book is that I wrote most of it actually on my iPad, which was kind of a fun
But
challenge.
really, on your
Yeah.
iPad with a keyboard or no keyboard on the touch
with a
screen?
keyboard, yeah.
With a keyboard, I
It
see.
has like the
Okay.
keyboard case thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a fun challenge for myself. But yeah, so definitely like bring any questions you have, drop them in the chat. And then the other thing is each chapter has a handful of exercises, and I really want to go through the solutions, because the solutions are not in the books. The solutions are on GitHub, which we'll point to that in a second. But really want to talk through the exercises and work through them together. So I guess that's kind of the only goal I have for each one of these, is just to kind of answer questions, review the main concepts, and then really focus on working through the exercises, which I think should be pretty fun.
Yeah. Sounds
And
good.
Alex, what's the schedule for this? It's roughly, we're doing sort of one a week, but we take a couple of breaks for we're taking a break next week for nodes.
The schedule is a bit weird, I would say, maybe, but we work around a couple of like you just said, a couple of the big points we have in our schedule already, where we can't really move about. So obviously next week we don't have a book club because it's nodes. But the week after we are back on the 23rd, so November 23rd. It's for me it's a late one, so it's a little bit out of the ordinary time wise. So it's 10 p.m. Central European time, so more in the what is that, afternoon Pacific, I think, and super late for Asia, so probably not even possible, or super early, depending how you take it. But then we are back at a little bit of an earlier time slot on the 1st of December. It's a Thursday though, so we move one day, but we move back to the Wednesdays on the in the new year, but on the 15th again Thursday, and then in from January on we are back on a Wednesday cadence. Yeah.
Cool.
So, but you can I'll try to make it as available as early as possible in the Neo4j events calendar and on a meetup online meetup page. So if you follow those channels, you'll see when it's up, and you can subscribe. And it will be public on YouTube or on LinkedIn as well. So you can probably roughly a week ahead. So you'll see hopefully well in advance when it is there. And we have a landing page as well. I can share that link as well. So you find in one landing page all the episode combined together. So.
And that's so neo4j.com/events, and then really filtering. So this page shows all of the Neo4j events.
Yep.
And then they'll show up here if you search for GraphQL. Probably one way for folks to find us.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll put them there. Probably I can do this already now, so I'll do this later this week. So all the episodes will be there, so you find them in one place, and then I'll add them to the other points as we go.
Cool. Great. Well, should we jump into chapter 1 then?
Yeah.
Cool. Let's do it. So, as Alex mentioned, this book is called Full Stack GraphQL Applications with React, Node.js, and Neo4j. And we're working through the book. In the book, we kind of build a business reviews application. So we talk about the requirements for what that is in this chapter, but basically we want to build a full stack application that we can search for businesses. We can view the results. We can submit reviews of the businesses. We can see personalized recommendations. Here are businesses you may be interested in based on your search history or based on other reviews from users, these sorts of things. And the book is available to download for free. Just fill out this form and you get the PDF, which I have open on the side. And it's also the physical book, which I have here. So if you like the Dead Tree version, that's available as well. So yeah, let's just jump in and like I said, in the time today, really, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'm curious what folks are thinking about. So definitely drop questions in the chat and we'll get to those. And then we'll talk through some of the main concepts and then the last 20 minutes or so work through the exercises today from chapter 1. So I've got the book over here. Some folks have asked me in the past about the cover and what's going on with the cover image.
Yeah, that's yeah. Let's talk about this because it's so weird. I don't know I mean, this is Manning does it, and I think O'Reilly also. What is going on with these strange covers for tech books?
Yeah, so O'Reilly is known for the animal covers, right? So they have a different animal illustration covering each one. I think the Neo4j Graph Database's O'Reilly book is what, an octopus,
It's an octopus, yes. Yeah.
Which makes sense. That's pretty graphy, right? And then Mark and Amy wrote the Graph Algorithms O'Reilly book, and that's some spider, which also is pretty graphy, right? Like a spider's building a web, has lots of legs. I can see that. And then Manning, their theme is these kind of old-timey illustrations. I think what they say is they like these sort of old-timey public domain illustrations to sort of highlight different cultures and sort of show that, okay, even these books are very technical about, computer topics. They like to highlight different cultures and sort of show that how those are relevant. And so the way it works for an author, at least in my case, was Manning came to me with, I don't know, maybe half a dozen different options to choose from. And this one, this one really stood out to me because so this is an illustration of, I think it says somewhere in here what this actually is, but it's an illustration of someone, I think, from the where is this? Preface, acknowledgements. Maybe not. It's an illustration of, oh yeah, here we go, about the cover illustration. Wait, what section is that? About the author? I don't see it. Well, anyway, it's about the, it's an illustration of someone from a Greek island in, I think, the 17 or 1800s. So I with like whatever the traditional dress of that time is. But what really stood out to me is that she's, smelling a rose. That's a very pleasant experience. And my goal with the book was to show how building an application with GraphQL can also be a very pleasant experience. So trying to convey that sort of building applications with GraphQL can be just as nice as smelling roses. So that's anyway what really jumped out at me. We'll see. see if other folks can resonate with that.
Yeah, I mean it's a nice picture. Yeah, totally.
For sure. Cool. So let's look at the table of contents, maybe just at a high level here, so we can see where we're going with the book. So the book's organized in 3 sections. The first part, getting started with full stack GraphQL, is really focused on the backend pieces. So in chapter 1, we talk about kind of an overview of each of the components. We talk about what we're going to build. And then in chapters 2, 3, and 4, we're really focused on building out the backend. So how do we build GraphQL APIs? How do we use the Neo4j database? And then throughout the book, we use a integration for Neo4j and GraphQL called the Neo4j GraphQL library. And so we dive deep into that in chapter 4. Then in part 2, we switch gears a little bit and start building out the front end of the application. In this book, we use React, and then we use Apollo Client, which is a library that integrates really well with all kinds of different front-end frameworks and also on mobile as well. But we use the React flavor of Apollo Client to handle data fetching and caching some of that functionality. And then in part 3, which we call full stack considerations, we look at some more advanced functionality that spans both front end and back end. So for example, chapter 7 covers authentication and authorization. And we do this both on the front end. We use the Auth0 React library. And then in the back end, we use some of the authorization features in the Neo4j GraphQL library that allow us to define authorization rules, such as who should have access to what pieces of information in our API, that sort of thing. And then we later on in that section, we also touch on how do I actually deploy my application using cloud services. So we use Netlify, AWS Lambda, Auth0, and Neo4j Aura to deploy our application. And then in the last chapter, we take a look at things like the relay model for cursor-based pagination. How do we work with some more advanced graph data models, things like relationship properties, some of the abstract types in GraphQL, like unions, these sorts of things. So that's the rough structure of where we're going.
So when you're reading this book, what would you say should people bring? Should they have any previous knowledge? Should they be skilled in some technologies? I mean, you talked about a couple here. Is there anything you would say maybe do this before diving into the book, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of like the persona for the book, I was really thinking of a very specific persona for the book, and that was really writing it for myself when I was kind of more early in my career as a software developer, and I was working at a startup and tasked with kind of re-architecting our application and kind of trying to figure out what combination of technologies to use. And I was thinking back to some of the questions and some of the problems that I had at that time. And so really the sort of domain knowledge and sort of expertise that are prerequisites for the book. I think we do a lot of JavaScript, so a lot of Node.js and also browser JavaScript. So I think it's helpful to have at least some background in JavaScript and some background in building web applications. That's, I would say, really the only hard requirements, because we don't really take too much time reviewing JavaScript and some of the Node.js ecosystem. But if you know how to create a new Node project, if you know how to sort of work with basic JavaScript in the browser, I think that's really pretty much the only prerequisites. I think the real people who will get the most out of the book are those who are, I guess, motivated to understand and build something with GraphQL. And we really try to touch on all the different pieces of the stack, both front end and back end. So not just how do I build a GraphQL API, not just how do I integrate it in a React application, but how do I go through all of the steps, starting from business requirements to building the back end, building the front end, deploying it, securing it, using cloud services. So we try to show how all those pieces fit together.
Cool.
So let's take a look at chapter 1. Chapter 1 is really introducing the concept of full stack GraphQL and what we mean by that. And really the focus of the book is GraphQL, but not just GraphQL on its own, like really GraphQL in context with all the other pieces of tooling, the other technologies that we're using to build a full stack application. And so there are a few sort of core components that we talk about, but this is sort of at a very, very high level, the basic architecture of what we're going to build. So GraphQL is a really specification for building APIs. And so the API is the application that sits between the database and the front end. So in this case, sitting between our Neo4j Database and our React application. And we use different tooling on the front end client. So we mentioned Apollo client already, but we also use Apollo tooling for building the GraphQL API application. In this case, we use a piece of Apollo tooling called Apollo Server. If you're not familiar with Apollo, Apollo makes lots of great open source tooling for working with GraphQL, both on the client, the server, and in the cloud. There's lots of different ways to approach the sort of full stack design, but I think really the Apollo tooling is probably the most widely used and has, I think, probably the largest community around different pieces of the GraphQL ecosystem. So we focus on that. So we talk a little bit about how these pieces fit together, and then talk about each one of the components of our stack individually. So we talk about GraphQL. We talk about the idea that with GraphQL, we're defining types. So GraphQL has a strict type system that describes exactly what data we want to work with, how that data is connected. So that's where the graph piece of GraphQL comes in, is that for each type, we have fields, so properties, attributes, but then we can also reference other types with these relationship fields, and that's describing a graph or connected data. And then at query time, we can ask for a traversal through that data graph that we've defined with our type definitions through a GraphQL query, and then we get back exactly the data that we've requested. So we talk a little bit in the book about comparing GraphQL to REST, which is a more, I guess I'll say, more well understood paradigm for building APIs. We talk about some of the advantages, such as being able to make just a single request to the backend to render the data for a view with GraphQL, whereas with REST, sometimes we have to make multiple requests to the backend. Say if we're fetching a list of blog posts and we want some information about the author of each blog post, in the REST paradigm, we may have to make a request to the server for each one of those blog posts to get the author information. In GraphQL, we can specify in one query to bring back all the information for a list of blog posts and the author for each one. And that has performance benefits. And we can also specify, just again, like I said, exactly the data that we've requested, which means we're sending less data over the network. GraphQL was open sourced by Facebook in 2015 or 2016. They built GraphQL internally to render the Facebook news feed. And if you think of mobile devices that are not always in strong networks, it's really, really important to limit the amount of data you're sending over the wire, but also limit the number of requests that you're making. So that was kind of the original purpose and design for GraphQL. And then when Facebook open sourced that, it turned out this was a paradigm that was very appealing for lots of developers.
I think that's a good important explanation, or here starting point, because we get often asked, GraphQL, does this mean graph query language? Is this a type of Cypher alternative, which is the query language we use at Neo4j, or the sound? It sounds almost like it is that, but then it isn't. So
yeah, exactly. I think initially when GraphQL was open sourced, a lot of folks thought that, oh, this is another query language for graph databases. And it became like very clear when you dig into a lot of the features and functionality in the design of GraphQL that it is very much not intended to be a database query language. It lacks a lot of the semantics and expressiveness for things you want to do in something like SQL or something like Cypher, and instead is really optimized for being the API query language. So even though we're talking about using GraphQL with a database, it's important to understand that we're talking about building that API layer that sits between the client and the database. We're not using GraphQL to query a database directly. There's still things like custom logic, authorization. We don't want to expose everything in our database to the world. And so GraphQL allows us to do that.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. So then we talk a bit about React. So React is a library for building user interfaces. We use Create React App, which is kind of the default way of getting started with React. A couple of things that are important to understand about React. One is that we use this extension to JavaScript, or maybe it's a language on its own, is a way to think of it, called JSX, which is kind of combining JavaScript and HTML. So we can create our components using JSX. There's other ways of using React. We don't really cover them in the book, though. We focus on using JSX. And then the other thing that's important to understand about React is this idea of components. So a component is really just a function that defines how to render, in this case, some data into our view. And components are really nice because we can compose them together to build more complex user interfaces. To work with data in React, we work with state. You have state, which is something that basically will trigger a re-render in your components as state changes, which is really nice. That's where the reactive part in React comes from, is that as state changes, our view updates automatically. Our view is reactive to that. So we cover some of those concepts, and later on, when we get to the front end section, we talk about how to handle data fetching and basically how do we treat GraphQL data as state in our React application. Then in the book, we talk a bit about Apollo tooling. We mentioned earlier, Apollo covers tooling both on the front end and the back end. Apollo itself, like I said, has lots of interesting open source tooling that they've built. They also have their cloud service, which allows for things like managing complex schemas that are stitched together in an enterprise, a schema registry. So how do I make sure that as I change my GraphQL schema, will that impact the rest of my application? Lots of performance monitoring. So lots of interesting things going on there. Then we talk a bit about Neo4j. So Neo4j is a graph database. That means that the data model that we use, unlike relational databases that use tables or document databases that are using something like a JSON document for the data model is a graph. And this, I think, is really interesting for working with GraphQL because there's basically a one-to-one mapping of what we call the property graph data model, which is a data model that we use with Neo4j, to the graph model of GraphQL. We said that we're defining our type definitions, we're defining the data available in the API with GraphQL, and that maps very nicely to the graph model in Neo4j. So when we talk about why would we use a graph database with GraphQL, I think there's two benefits that come up right away. One is that there's basically this one-to-one mapping between the data model that we're using in the database and the GraphQL data model, but the other is a performance advantage. So when we're constructing GraphQL queries, oftentimes we end up with this very nested query that is traversing the data graph. And in something like a relational database, to do the nesting traversals through the graph, we have to use joins, which can start to slow down as we have lots of data. In relational databases, the performance of a join is dependent on the size of the tables that we're joining. But in a graph database, the traversal from one node to another is not dependent on the overall size of the data. We have basically constant time performance for those joins. And so with GraphQL, we often end up with these very nested queries that are describing lots of traversals because we're trying to fetch all of the data that we need to render a single view in our application, which can oftentimes be very complex to express all of that in a single request to the backend. So using a graph database with GraphQL, we have that performance advantage sort of inherent in our choices of technology. So we'll see some other benefits as we dig into using the Neo4j GraphQL library. But if we're just thinking conceptually, why should we use GraphQL and graph databases together? I think those are the two that jump out right away. We also talk a little bit about Cypher in chapter 1 and some of the tooling that we use. So there's different ways to use Neo4j. There's Neo4j Desktop. There's Neo4j Browser, which we use to sort of test our Cypher queries and visualize some of the results. We talk about how do we use the Neo4j JavaScript driver to send queries. And then we just introduce this idea of the Neo4j GraphQL library, which allows us to, I'd say, reduce a lot of the boilerplate that we would otherwise be writing with GraphQL. But it's much more than that as well, which we'll talk about later on in the chapters. And so I see Peter asking in the chat if we can use Cypher queries with our GraphQL API. And the answer to that is yes. And this is one of those sort of additional features introduced by the Neo4j GraphQL library that I think is really important, which does allow us to define custom logic at the API level using Cypher. And we'll get to that in a lot of detail in chapter 4. Cool. So then we talk about sort of how these pieces fit together. So this diagram is maybe a little bit more detailed view of what we showed at the beginning, where we're now filling in some of the examples. Here we're searching for movies. So imagine we have a movie search application. What would the GraphQL query look like? How would that get translated into Cypher to send to the database? And then the data that's sent back is a JSON object, which we can use to render in our application. Okay, so and then we go through that hypothetical movie application to show how would we sort of use GraphQL? What is the data model for that look like? And so on, as kind of an example to show how the pieces fit together. But then we get to talking about what we're going to build in the rest of the book. So I mentioned earlier that the book is focused on really GraphQL in the context of other technologies. So we go through the step of building this application. In this case, we're building a business search application. So can I search for businesses? Can I view and submit reviews of businesses? And then can I show things like personalized recommendations based on reviews of others or based on my search history, these sorts of things. And so we just introduced the basic requirements for that in this chapter. And then we move on to the exercises section. So maybe before we jump to working through the exercises, maybe we'll pause and make sure we address any questions that are coming in, or folks, if you have questions, definitely drop them in the chat, and we'll be sure to address those.
Yeah, absolutely. Drop them in chat. Maybe I can have stab at one. Not necessarily on the content, but more on your writing experience, because I think it's, I mean, for me it sounds like very complicated. When do you decide it's finished? And because it's like, you know, there's always a new version coming out that's adding new features. So especially with now we talk about GraphQL, React, Apollo, Neo4j. This is already four tools or four environments that keep constantly evolving, and then you say, okay, then the next iteration and the next iteration, and it's always around the corner basically. But at some point you have to say, okay, now this is now the cutoff date. Was this very difficult?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So writing books about, you know, technology, like you say, is really hard to make sure that your book is not out of date as soon as it's written, right? Because in the technology world, everything moves very quickly, which is a good thing, right? It means that folks are sort of pushing the edge of the features that you have in a specific library. Things get re-architected, and so you want to make sure that the examples in your book are up to date. And yeah, this was a challenge. I think Manning, the publisher, is really good about putting out what they call the MEAP, which is the Manning Early Access Program, something like that. And so basically, once the first few chapters are written, they're made available for folks to read and see the code on GitHub. And so if any folks have been following along this experience, like started writing this book a while ago, and the first version of the MEAP came out a while ago, and we updated. I feel like I went through maybe 3 major rewrites or updates of this book as the technology sort of has evolved. I think the biggest evolving piece was the Neo4j GraphQL integration that changed quite a bit over time. And again, this is all a good thing, because it's showing that, you know, people are requesting new features or adding new functionality where that is needed. So, you know, I think technology books like this they're never quite done. There's a lot of things, and in chapter 9, I talk about a lot of the things that, you know, I wish I had time to dive into in the book. So, for example, for React, we use Create React App, which is sort of the default way of getting started with React. Next.js is a framework built on top of React that I think is now even more popular than Create React App. So I would have loved to dive into using Next.js with GraphQL. Similarly, one of the things we don't cover in the book is GraphQL subscriptions, which are like GraphQL's real-time pub sub methodology, which is super neat. But when I looked at, okay, how would we cover subscriptions in the manner that we've sort of organized this book, which is we have to talk about how we implement them in the back end and the front end. And there's kind of a lot going on there. And that was kind of ended up being out of scope of what we can properly cover the way we want to in the book. So it's, I don't know, it's kind of a trade-off. Because you want to get that information out there. You want to do it in a way that's true to how we've designed and organized the book. I will say, as the libraries change and some of the code samples need to be updated, we do maintain those on GitHub. I think here, yeah. So this is the GitHub repo for the book, so we can find the code and then also the example exercises here. So we have the code for each chapter. So I will continue to update the code, and as any of the exercise solutions change, we'll definitely update those there. For now, I think everything is up to date for the current versions of the different technologies that we're using, and certainly the concepts. So a big part of this book really is like I said, understanding how the pieces fit together. And those concepts, I think, are valid and will be valid for a while.
The concepts probably will never really go. I mean, as long as the technologies are relevant and fit together, as long as that's true, I think they will always be relevant. And I think it's great that you do the separate GitHub repository with all the code, so you maintain that, and that means if in a year from now some of the code examples would not work anymore, you can update that there, and people can still, when they read the book, and then can see, oh yeah, okay, this needs to change, but then at least they are aware of it, and then they don't sit with a book and they say, oh, why is it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, totally. And that's one of the benefits of doing ebooks too. Ebooks are in theory are easier to update than the paper versions. Cool. Well, let's start working through our exercises here, so we make sure we have enough time to cover those. And so we've got three basic questions here in the exercises. And as the book mentions, there's a link here to the GitHub page that we were just looking at that has the code for each chapter. There, I don't think we have code samples from chapter 1. We sort of just have some snippets that introduce some examples in the book, but we haven't started building our application yet. So if you look in the code directory, there's nothing for chapter 1. And then for each of those, for the rest of the chapters, we're basically building up the application. So you'll see eventually we get to, we have both our front end and back end code together in the different chapters. So here we have the API code, here we have the front end code, and we're sort of building on each chapter in there. And then you can find the exercises and the solutions linked as well. So our first question here is getting us sort of hands-on with using GraphQL. And so first question says, go to movies.neo4j-graphql.com. If we do that, we'll see something that looks kind of like this page. So this is GraphQL Playground. Let me get a little more space here. There we go. So this is GraphQL Playground, which is, I don't know, kind of like a query workbench for GraphQL. There's different flavors of these sort of browser-based tools for exploring and working with GraphQL APIs. There's GraphQL Playground, there's Graphical, and then Apollo has, as part of their Apollo Studio web service, they have, I think they call it Sandbox, which is part of Apollo Studio. But the functionality in all these tools is similar. We use a few of them through the book so that you can get experience with the different tooling. But the basic idea is we can view the basic documentation for the API. So one feature that's really, really nice about GraphQL is called introspection. And what this means is that for any already running GraphQL API, we can introspect the types that are available in the API. And we can basically say, hey, show me the data, show me the entry points for the API, show me the fields, show me how these types are connected. And then we can do things like generate this type of documentation. We can add functionality in developer tooling. So for example, if you use VS Code, there's a GraphQL extension for VS Code that will give you things like tab completion, syntax checking for your queries in your IDE. And this is all powered by the introspection feature of GraphQL, which is super powerful. So we can see here that we have an API about movies just by looking at the documentation. And we have queries. So in other APIs, we would see queries, and then we would have another section called mutations. Queries are going to be read-only operations. Mutations are going to be typically update operations where we're creating or updating data. But this is a read-only API. We don't want folks to go changing the plot summary of our favorite movies. So we're just reading things here. But each one of these queries is an entry point into the API. So we can start by searching for movies. We can start by searching for genres. We can search for users, actors, and so on, and then traverse the graph from the starting point. And we can also see the arguments. So we have at the top level a where argument and an options argument that gives us a bit more information here. So if we want to know, okay, what is this options argument? Oh, well, this allows us to do sorting, limiting, and offset for things like pagination. Cool. So we've got an API about movies. It tells us here we're going to write some queries. So find the titles of the first 10 movies ordered by title. And I have a query here. So the basic way that GraphQL Playground works is we write our GraphQL queries on the left side. Let me try to make this a little bigger. And then on the right side, we have our response. So I ran this query earlier just to make sure that everything was working here. And I'm starting with the movies entry point, and then I'm saying, give me the title. And in this case, I get every movie. So this is, I'm not sure how many movies we actually have in here, but you can see this is quite a large response here. And so instead of just showing us every movie, that's not going to be super helpful in our movie search application. I want to see just the first 10 in alphabetical order. So one thing we can do is if we look at our docs, and we were just looking at this movie options argument, we saw that we had sorting and limiting. So I think those are the two arguments we're probably going to want to use. So let's change this to now include, you can see as I start typing, I get this autocomplete. So let's add options, and if I do control space, I can see my autocomplete as well. So the first thing we're going to want to do is to do some sorting, and we're going to want to sort by title. And again, I'm just getting the autocomplete here. So even if I don't know how this API was constructed, I can just sort of use this as documentation to explore what my options are. So we'll say in descending order, and then the other is the limit here, and we said we wanted 10 results. So our GraphQL query looks something like this now, where I've added the options field argument to sort by title in descending order and give us only 10 results. And we can see that's exactly what we get, although I guess we wanted ascending order, actually. There we go. And you can see we have some special characters in here, so we're actually sorting by some of the special characters showing up first, but that's fine. If we go to, let's say, 100, once we get through all those special characters, we can start to go through numbers, then ABC, and so on. Cool. So that's the first part here. The next question is, who acted in the movie Jurassic Park? Well, let's see. I know we're probably going to want to start with the movie's entry point. And when we were looking at the field arguments for movies, we saw that one of the other arguments, in addition to options, was where. And so where, that sounds like a filtering function. And so I can quickly see all the filtering options I have here. So the first thing we want to do is let's see if we have a filtering option for title. So we can see the different filtering options we have basically for each field on our movie type. And so let's Jurassic Park. Let's see if we can find Jurassic Park by title. Cool, there it is. But our question is, who acted in the movie? So we can add fields to this is called a selection set, which is basically specifying what fields we want to bring back in our query. So we can see all the all the fields we have available on the movie. But what we want to do is we want to traverse our graph here a little bit and go from this movie Jurassic Park to the actors in the park. And we can see here we have this field actors, which in this case gives us a list of actor objects. The brackets here are indicating that this is a list, and it's giving us a list of the actor objects. The exclamations, that means that the actor is non-nullable. So in GraphQL, we can have optional fields. So all of these fields that don't have an exclamation on them are optional. For an actor, we might not know their bio, we might not know the date they were born, and so on. But for example, every movie is going to have at least a movie ID. That's what the exclamation means there.
Yeah. And an actor, I think that's what it said here, has to act in a movie, because otherwise it's,
Yeah, and in the list, it can be a little maybe a little obtuse what a non-nullable list field actually means. It doesn't mean that I couldn't get an empty list. Like it's possible that I could have a movie that maybe I don't know the actors are. So it just means I won't get null for the actors field, but the list, the array, might be empty.
Yep. Okay.
So I'm going to add actors here, and you can see I get an error message here because I must have a selection of subfields. And so again, this error is powered. I haven't sent this query yet. That error is powered by the client side syntax checking for my query, again, powered by introspection. And when I send that query, then the server says, hey, there's a problem here. And what this is saying is that, well, I need to include in my selection set of the actors fields, like which ones do I actually want to return? And in this case, we'll just return name. And so here I can see the actors in Jurassic Park by creating this sort of nested structure in my selection set.
And this is because in year and in budget and in title we didn't have to define this. In actors we had. So is this
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So title, budget, and year, these are called scalar fields. It means they just have a single value. So year is an integer, budget is 2, title is a string. But actors is an object or a relationship field, which means that there are more than one possible values for what I want to use to represent actor. There's more fields to select because it's traversing the data graph from one type to another. And so that's why we need to have this nested piece in our selection set to indicate not only what fields we want to return, but we could also do a nesting from here. So I think we have an acted in field, which gives us for the actor what other movies that they acted in. So Jeff Goldblum was in Jurassic Park, but he was also in all these other movies. And then of course I can do something like show me the genres of these movies as well. So here I've created much more nesting in my selection set, which is exactly what the next question is getting at. So what are the genres of Jurassic Park, and what other movies are in those genres? Well, to do that, we add the genres traversal now, and we're bringing back a lot more information than what we need here, because we're also including other movies and genres for the actors of Jurassic Park. But here's the genres for Jurassic Park: thriller, sci-fi, adventure, action, and so on. And then it's asking what are movies in those genres. So again, I just add more nesting to my selection set. So in this case, it's called movies. And back the title. And here's an important one. So we can also do field arguments at nested level in our selection set. So I can do something like an options limit 10 here. So I'm sure there are probably thousands of sci-fi and thriller movies that we have. We don't need to bring back every single one. So we can, at this nested level in our selection set, include the limit 10 here. Cool. And the final one here is what movie has the highest IMDb rating? So let's start over here. So, okay, we know we're going to do movies. Let's bring back title and IMDb rating. And so following from what we saw before, where we were sorting by title of the movie, let's see if we can sort by IMDb rating in descending order. And then it's asking for just the top one, but let's, I don't know, let's bring back 10 or so. And we don't get quite what we expect because now we're getting null for our IMDb rating. And so this is going back to the concept earlier where we said that some fields are nullable, some fields can be optional. So what we want to do in this case is we're going to add let's see if we can get some more room here. There we go. So let's add now a where clause to filter out these null IMDb, not IMDb ID, IMDb rating. So we're going to say where IMDb rating is not null. Let's see if this will work. It's not null. So null in all lowercase. We'll now filter for, we'll exclude any movies that we have a null value for IMDb rating, and then we'll order. And so we can see Band of Brothers with an IMDb rating of 9.6 is actually the highest in this data set that we have. So that was a little tricky one. That one requires you to kind of dig into the documentation and see that we actually have this where filter to be able to filter out some of the nulls. So I got some feedback that one was a little too hard for chapter 1, but I left it in there because I think we should have a few challenges.
Yeah.
So I know we're running short on time here, but let's just touch really quickly on the second one, and then we'll let everyone go. And for this one, I'm just going to jump to our solutions. So we'll cheat a little bit. So you can see the solutions are in here. We covered all of those. And so the question for this one is, if we consider the business reviews application, so we talked about the requirements for searching for businesses and being able to view and update business reviews. And the question is, generate GraphQL type definitions that allow us to sort of define this functionality at the GraphQL level. And so in the book, we introduce the GraphQL schema definition language, which is how we define our type definitions. And so basically, what we want to go through this process, and we talk about this in the book, this data modeling process is sort of identify what are the entities, those become our types, and then what are the fields that we want to represent for the different values. So business, we know business is going to have a name, business is going to have an address. We need some way to be able to search, to order by the average stars. So for all of the reviews, what are the best businesses, and so on. And we construct our GraphQL type definitions to be able to answer those questions by thinking also like, what are the entry points? So I know I want to be able to search by a search term. So I want to make sure that I have some entry point. In this case, this is a field on the query type. I want to have some entry point to be able to search for those businesses. And then exercise 3, this is really a thing to do on your own, which is to explore Neo4j Sandbox. So Neo4j Sandbox allows us to sign in and spin up Neo4j databases that are specific to us. We can load a bunch of different example data sets, or we can sort of create our own data. But for each one of the example data sets, we have some guides that walk us through how do we use Cypher to query the data, and so on. So we'll leave that one as an exercise for folks to go through, just to familiarize yourself with some of the Neo4j developer tooling. Cool. So we're out of time here. Hopefully folks thought that was helpful and interesting. Definitely download a copy of the book if you want to follow along. We're going to go through each one of these chapters, again, talking through the concepts, working through the exercises, and so on. Is there anything else we should talk about before we go, Alex?
No, I think that's what chapter 1 is all about. We do this regularly now, so tune in for chapter 2. If you have questions, take them to. We have a couple of outlets for questions, right? I mean, you can ask in the comments on the YouTube video. You can better yet go to the Neo4j community or the Neo4j Discord server. There's a GraphQL sub group on each of these. And if you have a question, everything, team is looking at those and take them there. Another option is obviously Stack Overflow, which is always a good one to go. But yeah, if any of these points would be great to gather your questions. Otherwise, looking forward to seeing you next time, I guess. So maybe it's a good time, right? Download the book in between now and the next episode. Start with chapter 1, and then probably maybe a few more questions would come. Otherwise, I can always ask a few stupid questions, and yeah. I think with that we are done. Thank you, Will. Thank you for obviously thank you for writing the book, and now for guiding us through the 9 chapters. So I'm definitely looking forward to chapter 2. Thank you all for watching. Tune in for notes next week. There's one more live stream I'm doing this week, tomorrow, 5 p.m. So Central European time. So now basically, but tomorrow. I have invited a couple of Neo4j colleagues to talk about what's happening with Neo4j 5, which we launched today publicly, as well as all the other segments around Neo4j Bloom, which is the visualization part, graph data science, and graph algorithms, as well as Cypher in general. So I'm looking forward to that. So that's happening tomorrow. And yeah, Nodes is next week.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, hope to see you at Nodes at least next week. That should be a lot of fun.
Definitely. Thank you all for watching. Take care, everybody, and bye-bye.
Cheers.